Eudora Welty had and she went to Millsap, went to Bellhaven. Now, okay. She was delighted to get to Bellhaven and know that Miss Eudora had just written a book, as living in town right across from the school. And so she said to a few girls, said, let's call Eudora and get her, come over here and talk to us. And so Elizabeth said, fine, I'll call. So she did call. Miss Eudora said, I'm sorry, I don't do speeches. So that's my excuse today. I don't do speeches. But Miss Eudora slowed down and said, but if you have a number of girls like to get together in the corner of a room somewhere, I'll come over and we'll just sit down and talk. So let's talk. One brief note on the program, on the second page, there's a little message from Eudora Welty. I just want to make sure you have a copy of this, because I hope to make a reference to it as we leave. Okay? This all started in May.
Mr. Wilson, I've been interrupting you most of my life. Mr. Wilson told me I've aged a lot in the last 40 years since he's seen me last. We've known each other for a long time. I would love to welcome, and I do welcome all of y'all to Cotesworth. It is so great to see this crowd come out. Thank y'all for coming out to hear our celebration of Elizabeth Spencer. We really do want to thank Mississippi State University for putting these types of events on and then using Cotesworth as the venue for that. I mean, to me, I was telling someone I've been coming out here since I was 4 years old, and it's breathtaking every time I come. I hope the same is true with y'all. These events help play it up, and we thank you for that. Again, thanks Mississippi State for doing these programs here. And for those of you who don't know Sarah, Sarah is on board with the Cotesworth Cultural Center here, but she's also works very hard to get these events here. And in addition to that, she drove all the way from Mississippi State yesterday. We had a work day here, and she came all the way from Mississippi State. And the first time I saw her, she was looking out that window and doing that. She wasn't waving, she was cleaning the window.
And I'm glad the smears cannot show.
But she works, very hard for Mississippi State. She also works very hard here, and we appreciate that as Mother's Day School. Again, thank y'all so much for coming out this afternoon. I'm Kenny Downs. I am the new president of the Cotesworth Cultural Center. I'm trying to fill the shoes of Margaret Adams over here, who did such a wonderful job over the several years that she was in this. And again, if we can ever help y'all with anything, we would love to do that. Over to
Well, no, thank you, Kenny, and for the good work that he and all of the board members and volunteers do for the Cotesworth. This is an extraordinary place for Mississippi, and MSU, in keeping with its belief in outreach, is particularly thrilled to have the opportunity to partner with Cotesworth in bringing free educational programs to this region of the state. So we thank all of you who work so hard day in and day out for the well-being of Cotesworth, and to all of you for coming and supporting these programs. And we know we're in for a special treat. We heard some wonderful memories shared and look forward to hearing some more. And we also have some memories from Miss Spencer that she was willing to share with us. So maybe if we can hear a few words from her and hear a few more of your wonderful memories. No, you're fine. And did some readings of her work.
Well, my mother always told me, when you go uptown, you got to speak to everybody. Don't let them think you're a hi-hat. Hi-hat was a bad term. And so I would speak and speak, and now I'm speaking again. So hello, everybody in Carrollton. Where I was born was in a little town called Carrollton, Mississippi. It's people always said I was from the Delta, but that's not true. Carrollton was in the hills, and it practically overlooked the Delta because it wasn't very far from the Delta. Greenwood was our nearest town, but we were always scurrying over there to go shopping, and I like the Delta, I really do, but I somehow prefer the contour of the hills is so beautiful. And down in front of our house, we saw a broad sweep of territory that we owned, and right down to the creek. That was Big Sand Creek, and Big Sand Creek was always a sleeping threat because if water got up high, it would flood our property, but it happened very seldom. All of it, I guess. I knew everybody. Everybody knew each other in a town that small, and the feeling that you're known about, and if you do anything that isn't right in line with what you ought to do, it's going to be talked about. That's certainly true, but I don't remember any scrapes I got into that made any particular difference. But I know my mother was always afraid that both my brother and I might do something that got talked about. And when I started writing, they were rather upset because there were naturally some very realistic things in the text, and people didn't always talk just the way that she thought people should talk, and so this upset them a lot. And I think they were somewhat embarrassed by having a daughter who was a writer who wrote realistic novels. Well, I guess the shadow of Carrollton is in everything I do, because if you're going to write, you've got to write about people, and where do you get the people from? Well, in some ways, there must have been shadow images of those people in the characters, but I wasn't particularly aware of that when I was writing. I wouldn't have wanted to offend anybody, but still the resemblances were there, and I think that embarrassed my family a lot. See, if it's in the hills, and the town terrain is very, it's up and down. And so I remember beautiful houses on the tops of hills, especially. The one up the street from our house was on a hill, and it was a beautiful Southern colonial type house, you know, with columns and everything. You've seen pictures of those. And it's now called the Oaks, and it's owned by, I think, by the editor of the town newspaper, but in those days it was owned by the Olsons, and they were distant cousins of ours. And Lawrence Olson turned out to be a Japanese expert. He went to a language school during World War II and learned Japanese, and he was very well known. Wound up as a lecturer in New England in the Ivy League bunch of colleges. So if there's a famous person from Carrollton, it's probably Lawrence. Favorite childhood memories? Well, a whole host of them. I wrote a memoir called Landscapes of the Heart. If you read that, you'll see a whole host of memories. Well, I don't know, just a feeling of friendliness toward the people that still live there, but I don't know anybody that still lives there. I was telling you about Wilton Sanders, but he lives in a town. It's not even a town, it's just a crossroads. It's called Black Hawk, and I guess it was an old Indian town, because there are a lot of remains of Indians still around. The Choctaws were very much resident now, and you used to pick up arrowheads in the pasture. A lot of people, I remember boys coming to school with either taking the rattlesnake's rattles off or the Indian heads were two prizes they used to exhibit around at school. The schoolhouse was right up the road from me, so I only had to walk to school. I was brought up around horses, and I always had my own horse, and I used to ride out from Carrollton to something called Shaw's Pond, where we would give picnics in the summer and go swimming. But just riding out by myself to Shaw's Pond was kind of a risky thing to do, I guess, but I loved doing it. It was a beautiful kind of in the woods sort of feeling of that pond, and very pretty, and had a diving board and all the equipment for, you know, just having fun in summer. Well, I think so, because people kept bringing these things up. See, a lot of people in Mississippi were writing then. There was a good number of good writers around, and they used to have a game that went on in beauty parlors where they had the books that people had written, and they were trying to pick the people out. It was called Picking Out the People. And so everybody said, oh, that's certainly so-and-so. I recognize that as so-and-so. And so this game went on, whether it was true or productive or anything or not, I don't know. The first novel was about a small town, and that's where people thought I had taken whole people from home, but I was trying not ever to do that, but it seems it got loose from me anyway. But the second novel was laid in the Delta, about a man who came down from the hills and got himself a plantation in the Delta, and about his various ups and downs and his family and all. And then that was that. And then the third novel was The Voice at the Back Door, which was very well reviewed and published everywhere. It was published, I don't know how many countries. It was about racial matters. You see, we were brought up around, it was, I suppose, more black people than they were white. And so I had a good window to look on the behavior of people toward race relationships. And it was strictly aimed at that. And of course it got very bad reviews from, just verbally, from people at home who thought I had gone way too far in talking about this. But it had a good sale and notice nationally and internationally. So that was one of my best. It's still in print. All my books in print. And then I got a Guggenheim Fellowship and decided to go to Italy to write a book. I wrote The Voice at the Back Door mainly in Italy, but I thought some distance from what I was writing about would be conducive to my seeing it more objectively. And I had been to Italy on my first trip abroad. I had a friend who was working for the State Department in Germany, and I took a French freighter out of New Orleans and went to Bordeaux in France, and then got a visa and went into Germany to see her. I visited with her and her boyfriend for about a month, but I still had time before I was due back in the States, a month, and my visa had run out for Germany. So I went down into Italy just to see what it was like, and I just fell in love with it. I thought it was the most beautiful country and just so impressive, and it made me so happy to be there that when I got the Guggenheim, a year or two later, I went back there to write my book, and that's where I met my husband. So instead of staying 1 year in Italy, I stayed 5 years. And from that, I got enough stored up material to write a book that's still very popular called The Light in the Piazza. You may have seen that. And so that's still in print. And it's been made into a movie and made into a musical. The musical is still traveling around.
Well, we partnered with the University of North Carolina for that interview, so that was done just about 2 weeks ago. So certainly current, so it's wonderful for her to share those memories of Carrollton and Carroll County. And again, we're fortunate to have Mr. Sanders share some of his memories. After he shares a few more of those, which he got us off to the perfect start by sharing some of those remembrances. And after he shares a few more, we will see, in accordance with your program, another brief video montage about Carroll County and with a reading by Elizabeth Spencer. And then we will have readings done by Josephine Neal Browning, Jerry James, and Lori Bell.
Thank you. turn back the clock to 1936. The whole state had gone through the roaring 20s, suffered under the breaks and downfalls of 1929. We got used to spending money we didn't have. So in 36, they said, we got to look down and find some money, or we're not going to have schools in Carroll County next year. Well, some of the heads got together. There was this small school up in Carrollton. I just mentioned the famous name. Carrollton Separate School. Another major town was right across the creek, North Carrollton Consolidated School. And then there's a whole list of them. It's almost boggles the mind. All of them in trouble because of money. So the leaders of the Carrollton and North Carrollton School sat down and said, what are we going to do? Mr. Spencer, Elizabeth's father, was on the board at Carrollton, and he said, he was a businessman. He said, we can get the money. The state will give us some money if we'll just get busy and consolidate and make sense out of the school system. So everybody said, not having any money, we better take it. So they decided to do it. They sat down and consolidated a school which they built in North Carrollton, and to keep everything quiet, they named it J.Z. George Super Consolidated High School. No one could argue with the name of George. So the schools were formed, classes began in 45. Elizabeth Spencer, 40. Elizabeth Spencer was in the 10th grade. She came over to George across the creek and registered with the 10th grade. I was in the 9th grade. I was 2 years behind Elizabeth. So we weren't classmates yet. We were just schoolmates. And George is getting a football team. Hallelujah. The next breath, J.Z. George is going to have a band. So this unusual old fella came in with a car full of instruments. All of them old, used to be rented or bought. We would go have a band. It's open to anybody in the school. We ended up with some small people in there, but they were there. They showed up. Elizabeth was in the 11th grade. I was in the 9th grade. We walked into the band room, and both of us were holding the clarinet. Okay, you kids can start learning the clarinet. It's not the easiest instrument in the band. If you have to put a tricky little reed, and it's not as simple as anything. You just put your mouth on a metal mouthpiece and blow. So Elizabeth and I got to work. We had to work our way through about 20 pages of creak, screak, scratch, scratch, scratch. But we stayed with it, and we managed to get together. But you can't beat friendship starting in a band room trying to learn to play a clarinet. Neither one of us have forgotten those days. But with that, life went on. Elizabeth graduated, went to Belhaven, went to Vanderbilt for a master's, and who knows where. Overseas, Italy, other places, always writing. She carried a notebook and a pencil with her from the time she was in high school. She never lacked for a story. She never wondered what she was going to write about. She was just going to wonder, how can I write about these items I already know about? She just had visions of characters, of situations, and her short story was just great. She had wonderful early acceptance, critical acclaim, a lot of fans. She kept writing, getting commendations from all over the country. Every critic had something to say good about her work. And I'm convinced it was because it was the best it could possibly be. I think Elizabeth was her own best critic, because when she put the last polish, it was ready and it was accepted critically and all over the world. Now, I came back, I went in the Navy. I was looking for flying in the Navy. So actually we got back here after 40 years and lived with my wife's family in Blackhawk. And pretty soon Elizabeth Spencer started showing up in Mississippi for a book signing at Lemuria and Jackson, at Turnrow in Greenwood, at some other conference. But when she made an appearance in Mississippi, my wife and I, if possible, were there. And we always renewed our friendship over the years. Now, let's go back next week. We're doing fine on time. This program was put out, and I heard about it, so I called Elizabeth, who had a telephone number for years. And I said, I want to be there. She said, I would like to also, but I cannot. I said, I just physically cannot make the trip. She said, mentally, I'm as sharp as I ever was. And she is. Any of you that have talked to her in recent years is just surprised at the strength of her voice. So I said, well, Elizabeth, I saw a few words a few weeks ago that I wanted to share with you, and I was going to wait until I saw you. But you're not going to be there for the event. I'd like to run them by you now, and if it's okay with you, I'd just like to pass them along to the friends of you who will be there. So I gave her the words, and she said, oh, I'm not old. I said, Elizabeth, you're not old. She said, I haven't written anything in 4 years. I said, you're just aged. You're not old, you're like fine wine. And boy, don't worry about your fans. Every year coming out of every high school in the country, there are young ladies like you were, ready to get a pencil and paper and jot down a poem, a thought, a story. So you'll have readers that you don't even know about yet. Oh, well, yeah, I guess. So I gave her the words, and she said, I like that. And I would feel it was a compliment. And I'll give it to you now. There is a fountain of youth. There is a fountain of youth. It is your mind, your talents, the creativity you want to bring to your life and the lives of people you love. When you learn to tap this source, you will have soundly conquered age. Thank you.
Thank you.
One word before I leave, because I'm not going to get a chance to get back to the mic. You have your program. There is a note at the bottom of the second page from your adorable relative, and there was a phrase I want to call to your attention. Look at it. and a certain prankish gaiety of spirit that Elizabeth Spencer brings into her writing. And this is her last book. And if that doesn't make you smile, starting over. That was the Elizabeth to begin with. Thank you.
Since I've met so many fellow Mississippians here, I thought I would read the one that relates the most to Mississippi, and it's laid in North Carolina, where I live now. Those of you who write fiction, I know I've got a lot of poets here, but those of you who write fiction know that sometimes you write about a character and it doesn't want to let you go. It says, well, one story is not enough, so you have to tell another one. So the character in this story, I've written several stories about, is a man named Edward Glenn. And he's from a very good family in Mississippi. We all from very good families. Right? But he married a woman in Mississippi that didn't get along with at all. They fought all the time. And finally they were divorced. And so being very put out by his life, and by that he traveled to Mexico, and there he met another woman and fell in love with her, and she was from California, so he married her and went to California to live a while. There's another story about all that, and then she died. So now the name of the new book is Starting Over, which applies to a good many things and a good many people, I guess. But the name of this story is Return Trip. He decides to go back home to the South and visit people that meant a lot to him. And one place he goes is to visit this couple in North Carolina at the moment, and then he'll probably go on to Mississippi, which people do. It was during a summer season. Patricia and Boyd were spending together in North Carolina, in the North Carolina mountains, that Edward reappeared. He left a message on the answer phone predicting arrival the next afternoon, saying not to give a thought to driving into Asheville for him. He would rent a car and come out, if at all welcome. At all welcome sounded more than slightly aware that he might not be. Yet, of course, Patricia thought at once they were going to say, "Come ahead, we'd love to see you," whether it was true or not. As for me, she thought it really is true, though she doubted if it was for Boyd. Edward had a charming way of annoying Boyd, she thought, though Boyd wouldn't say charming. Patricia stood out on the porch of the cottage theirs for the summer and looked out at the nearest mountain, thinking about Edward. Boyd soon joined her. Wonder what he's got in mind. Oh, he won't be a bother. He'll probably be going on someplace else. She could have asked but didn't just what it was Boyd thought Edward had in mind. Money used to be a problem for him, but family business might also be involved. Boyd never cared for him. She knew Edward was acknowledging that. Maybe he just wants to see us, she offered. Why not a dozen other people? Those two. He has affections, and God knows after what's happened he needs to find some. Nobody on the West Coast has any? Well, but his wife died. Outside that, you'll ask. Certainly I'll ask. He'll tell me. But then you won't know either. She whirled around annoyed. Don't brand him as a liar before he even gets here. Boyd apologized. He's your cousin, he allowed. Patricia said what she always said, but we're not close kin. In fact, hardly family at all. Boyd had learned that just as there were complicated ways Mississippians took of proving kin, so there were similar ways of disproving it. On a June afternoon at sunset, an American woman and her daughter fended their way along a crowded street in Florence and entered with relief the spacious Piazza della Signoria. They were tired from a day of tramping about with a guidebook, often in the sun. The cafe that faced the Palazzo Vecchio was a favorite spot for them. Without discussion, they sank down at an empty table. The Florentines seemed to favor other gathering places at this hour. No cars were allowed here, though an occasional bicycle skimmed through, and a few people passing met in little knots of conversation, then dispersed. A couple of tired German tourists, all but harnessed in fine camera equipment, sat at the foot of Cellini's triumphant Perseo, slumped and staring at nothing. Margaret Johnson, lighting a cigarette, relaxed over her aperitif and regarded the scene that she preferred before any other anywhere. She never got enough of it, and now in the clear evening light that all the shadows had gone from, the sun being blocked away by the tight bulk of the city, she looked at the splendid old palace and forgot that her feet hurt. More than that, she could almost lose the sorrow that for so many years had been a constant in her life. About the crenellated tower where the bells hung, a few swallows darted. Margaret Johnson's daughter, Clara, looked up from the straw of her orangeade. She too seemed quieted from the fretful mood to which the long day had reduced her. What happened here, Mother? Well, the statue over there, the tall white boy, is by Michelangelo. You remember him. Then, though it isn't a very happy thought, there was a man burned to death right over there, a monk. Any story attracted her. Why was he burned? Well, he was a preacher who told them they were wicked and they didn't like him for it. People were apt to be very cruel in those days. It all happened a long time ago. They must feel sorry about it because they put down a marker to his memory. Clara jumped up. I want to see. She was off before her mother could restrain her. For once, Margaret Johnson thought, why bother? In truth, the space before them, so satisfyingly wide like a pasture, might tempt any child to run across it. To Margaret Johnson, through long habit, it came naturally now to think like a child. Clara, she now saw, running with her head down to look for the marker, had bumped squarely into a young Italian. There went the straw hat she had bought in Fiesole. It sailed off prettily, its broad red ribbon a quick mark in the air. The young man was after it. He contrived to knock it still further away, once and again, though the day was windless. His final success was heroic. Now he was returning, smiling, too graceful to be true. They were all too graceful to be true. Clara was talking to him. She pointed back toward her mother. Oh, Lord, he was coming back with Clara.
Benji Hamilton swore he twisted his ankle in one of those same marble holes once when he came to pick me up for something in my senior year in high school. For all I know, they're still there. But Benji was more than likely drunk, and so would hardly have needed a marble hole for an excuse to fall down. Once, before we got the cattle gap, he couldn't open the gate and fell on the barbed wire trying to cross the fence. I had to pick him out, thread at a time. He was so tangled up, Mama said, "What were you two doing out at the gate so long last night?" "Oh, nothing, just talking," I said. She thought for the longest time that Benji Hamilton was the nicest boy that had ever walked the earth. No matter how drunk he was, the presence of an innocent lady like Mama, who said drinking in the same tone of voice as she would have said murder, would bring him around faster than any number of needle showers, massages, ice packs, prairie oysters, or quick dips in December off the northern bank of Lake Ontario. He would straighten up and smile and say, "You made any more peach pickle lately, Miss Sadie?" He could even say peach pickle. And she'd say no, but that there was always some of the old for him whenever he wanted any. And he'd say that was just the sweetest thing he'd ever heard of. But she didn't know what she was promising. She didn't know what she was promising. Anything as good as her pickle peach ought to be guarded like gold. And she'd say, well, for most anybody else, she'd think twice before she'd offered any. And he'd say, if only everybody was as sweet to him as she was. And they'd go on together like that till you'd think that all creation had ground and wound itself down through the vistas of eternity to bring the two of them face to face for exchanging compliments over peach pickle. Then I would put my arm in his so it would look like he was helping me down the porch steps out of the reflexes of his gentlemanly upbringing, and off we'd go. It didn't happen all the time like I've made it sound. In fact, it was only a few times when I was in school that I went anywhere with Benji Hamilton. Benji isn't his name either. It's Foster. I sometimes called him Benji to myself after a big, overgrown, 33-year-old idiot in The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. Not that Foster was so big or overgrown or even 33 years old back then, but he certainly did behave like an idiot.
I'm going to read from Landscapes of the Heart, chapter 4, which is entitled Christian Education. And you will see some of that, how did Eudora Welty say what did she say?
Prankish.
That prankish, yes. You'll see some of this prankish gaiety of spirit that Elizabeth Spencer has. This is about her grandfather, her mother's father, whom she loved dearly. It was a Sunday afternoon like no other, for we were there alone for the first time. I hadn't started the school yet, and he had finished it long ago. I was the only one free to be with him all the time. And the same went for his being with me. We babysat each other. But that word wasn't known then. A great many things were known, however. Among them, I always had to go to Sunday school. It was an absolute that the whole world was meant to be part of the church. And if my grandfather seldom went, it was a puzzle no one tried to solve. Sermons were fate I had only recently got big enough to be included in. But I had been enrolled in Sunday school classes since I could be led through the door and placed on a tiny red chair, my feet not even connecting to the floor. It was always cold at the church. Even in summer, it was cool. Today, I might not be going to Sunday school. My mother and father were out of town. They had got into the car right after breakfast and had driven away to a neighboring town. A cousin had died and they were going to the funeral. I was too young to go to funerals, my mother said. After they left, I sat on the rug near my grandfather. He was asleep in his chair before the fire, snoring. Presently, his snoring woke him up. He cut himself some tobacco and put it in his mouth. "Are you going to Sunday school?" he asked. "I can't go unless somebody takes me there," I said. "Nobody said I had to take you," he remarked, more to himself than to me. It wasn't the first time I knew we were in the same boat, he and I. We had to do what they told us to do, being outside the reality where things really happened. But by the same token, we didn't have to do what they didn't say. Somewhere along the line, however, my grandfather had earned rights I didn't have. Not having to go to church was one. Also, he had his own money and didn't have to ask for any. He looked out the window. "It's going to be a pretty day," he said. How we found ourselves on the road downtown on Sunday morning, I don't remember. It was as far to get to town as it was to get to church, though in the opposite direction. And we both must have known that, but we didn't remark upon it to each other. My grandfather walked to town every day except Sunday, when it was considered a sin to go there. For the drugstore was open and the barbershop too on occasions, if the weather was fair, and the filling station was open. My parents thought the drugstore had to be open, but that they should sell drugs only, and that the filling stations and barbershops shouldn't be open at all. There should be a way to telephone the filling stations in case you had to have gas for emergency use. This was all worked out between them. I often heard them talk about it. No one should go to town on Sunday, they said, for it encouraged the era of those who kept their stores open. My grandfather was a very tall man. I had to reach up to hold his hand while walking. He wore dark blue and gray herringbone suits, and the coat flap was a long way up, the gold watch chain almost out of sight. I could see him walking, see his walking cane opposite me, briskly swung with the rhythm of his stride. It was my companion. Along the way, it occurred to me that we were terribly excited, and the familiar way looked new and different, as though a haze that had hung over everything had been whipped away all at once like a scarf. I was also having more fun than I'd ever had before. When he came to the barbershop, my grandfather stopped aside and spoke to the barber and to all who happened to be around, brought out by the sunshine. They spoke about politics, the crops, and the weather. The barber, who always cut my hair, came over and looked to see if I needed another trim, and my grandfather said he didn't think so, but I might need a good brushing. They had left so soon after breakfast, it's a wonder I was even dressed. Somebody who come in after said, "Funeral in Grenada, ain't it?" Which was the first anybody had mentioned it, but I knew they hadn't needed to say anything because everybody knew about my parents' departure and why they were there. Things were always known about. I saw, but not cared about too much either. The barber's strong arms, fleecy with reddish hair, swung me up into his big chair where I loved to be. He brushed my hair, then combed it. The great mirror sparkled and everything was fine. We presently moved on to the drugstore. The druggist, a small crippled man, hobbled toward us, grinning to see us, and he and my grandfather talked for quite some time. Finally, my grandfather said, "Get the child a strawberry cone." And so I had it. Miraculous. and the world of which it was the center expanded about it with gracious, silent delight. It was a thing too wondrous actually to have eaten, and I don't remember eating it. It was only after we reached home at last, and I entered the house, which smelled like my parents and their things, that I knew what they would think of what we had done, and I became filled with anxiety and other forebodings. Then the car was coming up the drive, and they were alighting in a post-funeral manner, full of heavy feelings and reminiscence, and inclined not to speak in any ordinary way. When my mother put dinner in order, we sat around the table not saying much. "Did the fire hold out all right?" he said. She asked my grandfather. "Oh, it was warm. Didn't eat much." He ate quietly, and so did I. On Sunday afternoon, we all sat around looking at the paper. My mother had doubts about this, but we all indulged the desire anyway. After the ordeal of dressing up, of Sunday school and the long service and dinner, it seemed almost a debauchery to be able to pitch into those large crackling sheets, especially the funner papers, which were garish with color and loud with exclamation points, question marks, shouting, and all sorts of misdeeds. My grandfather had got sleepy before the fire and retired to his room while my mother and father had climbed out of their graveside feelings enough to talk a little and joke with one another. "What did you all do?" my mother asked me. "How did you spend the time while we were gone?" "We walked downtown," I said, for I had been laughing at something they had said to each other and wanted to share the morning's happiness with them without telling any more, letting any real trouble in, but my mother was on it quick as anything. "You didn't go to the drugstore, did you?" And they were both looking. My face must have had astonishment on it as well as guilt. Not even I could have imagined them going this far. Why, on the day of a funeral, should they care if anybody bought an ice cream cone? "Did you?" my father asked. The thing to know is that my parents really believed everything they said they believed. They believed that awful punishments were meted out to those who did not remember the Sabbath was holy. They believed about 1,000,000 other things, and they were terribly honest about it. Much later on, my mother went to my grandfather's room. I was silently behind her, and I heard her speak to him. "She says you took her to town while we were gone and got an ice cream." He had waked up and was reading by his lamp. At first, he seemed not to hear. At last, he put his book face down in his lap and looked up. "I did," he said lightly. A silence fell between them. Finally, she turned and went away. This, as far as I know, was all. Because of that incident, that certain immunity of spirit my grandfather possessed was passed on to me. It came, I think, out of the precise way in which he put his book down on his lap to answer. There was a lifetime in the gesture distilled, and I have been a good part of that long growing up to all its meaning.
This is from the introduction to her book, Light in the Piazza. The first time I saw Italy was in August of 1949, and I was half asleep. It was the third final month of my first summer abroad, my first trip to Europe. I had undertaken the venture on the modest proceeds of my first novel and the invitation from a close friend to visit her in Germany, where she had been working for 3 years with the American occupation. Except for a happy time I had spent in Paris while waiting for my permit to enter Germany, I had had so far little to rejoice about. To my friend and her fiancé, who tried their best to see that I had a good time, I must have seemed hopelessly uninitiated to the moral rigors of post-war Europe. To them I must have been like a chirpy sparrow flitting by accident through the horrors of a Max Ernst painting. I can see that now. My country training, for instance, had me view all visits as a little like house parties, a bad mistake. While they worked daily in their government offices in cloudy Bad Nauheim, I hung around an empty apartment a friend of theirs had lent me, reading or walking in the village, knowing scarcely a word of German. I shivered at the pool. What, besides the temperature, was the difference between this and a dull summer in some little southern town? There, at least, friends might call and come. I took to riding horses at a local stable, and so met a young Viennese who began to ask me out. He too was at loose ends, waiting for a work permit. My friends rose up with disapproval and suspicion. Who was he? What did he want? Mississippi old maids, a dozen years back, had cut up this way. I had to give up a pleasant friendship. My friends had worked in Nuremberg during the trials, and in this and many other episodes, they must have been right, as my life so far, they pointed out, had not got me prepared for things there. All miseries end. This one ended for us all three when my pass ran out. I had a month to spend somewhere. What to do? Drearily, Germany had got to me too. I agreed that the best choice was Italy. There might at least, I thought, be some sun. I came down on the night train to Milan. Sun. In the pre-dawn light, I crept by taxi through the kind of bombed-out area I had become used to seeing in German towns. I wondered, as I locked the door to my hotel room in a bare new structure that still smelled of fresh cement, if I shouldn't go back to Paris after a few days and see people there again before my return. It had been the one happy time, with little French restaurants to discover and the sights to see, picnics in the Bois de Fontainebleau and evenings at the Domingo. With this resolve, I slept and woke. Breakfast came up, coffee such as I had never known before, rich, smooth, and hot, tender croissants, gobs of butter and jam. I pulled a blind. Sun poured into the room. I opened a window. Singing came up from the streets. All this in a vanquished city whose horrors of so short a time ago must linger still. Still unbelieving, I went out, found my way to the cathedral, bought a guidebook, wandered, fed pigeons at a cafe in a piazza. I smiled and talked to beautiful, smiling people without knowing a word they said. Well, maybe a little Americana. See, that was easy, as was much else. That entire month, I never carried my own bag or lacked for a guide. Waiters guessed what I might like and brought it. Workmen stopped building new walls to show the way to galleries and palaces. Sitting in the sun at that happy day's end, I felt that life had begun once more. If my friends in Germany had been stationed in Italy, I wondered, would things have been different? So pondering, I walked around till a certain truth dawned. I could think whatever I liked about anybody or anything, but everywhere around me, Italy was making its first great statement. If I have dwelt too much here on that unfortunate time in Germany, it was only as a preface to Italy, only to show that there was never a heart more ready for Italy to impress. And the measure of what Italy could do was astounding, and simply cannot to this day be taken. And then she goes on to describe Italy and different places she went to. In Rome, a young Canadian who often ate at the same restaurant as I asked me to the opera in the baths of Caracalla. It was Berlioz's The Damnation of Faust. Every bit as ignorant as my friends in Germany believe, I loved the spectacle with little knowledge of what was going on. It was drama beneath the stars, with attendant ruins and cypresses against a velvet Roman sky. We walked back along the Via Appia at midnight holding hands. Time to go? Oh no! Not everything, of course, that came after that magic summer of 1949 was good or even pleasant. Italy is a poor country where life is hard. Not all Italians are helpful and charming. Not everything is a delight. Illusion is, for one thing, that which comes before disillusion. But Italy, not being an illusion, remains. It is itself the true measure of whatever is said or done or written about it. One can hope to rise up against that measure, but failing that, at least to be seen by that light.
Well, thank you certainly to all of our program participants for sharing such wonderful memories and wonderful words written by Elizabeth Spencer. This truly means a lot to us. And thank you again to the board and the volunteers of Cotesworth who worked hard to put this day together, and a special thanks to Catherine Williams who worked on logistics for today's program. Again, Cotesworth is a nonprofit organization. It is run by volunteers and stays open due to donations and contributions. And there is a donation box on the table in the hallways if you are so inclined. And also on the table will be this poster if you would like to sign it to Elizabeth Spencer. We will be framing this and sending it to her along with other mementos from today's program. She was certainly very gracious to take part in that interview and send a special welcome to us. And I also want to give a special thank you to Octavian Johnson with MSU Libraries. This is not his regular job, but he went above and beyond to be here this afternoon because he knows that I am technologically challenged. So were it not for him, we may have not seen those videos from Elizabeth Spencer. So a special thank you to Octavian. And of course, thank you to all of you for coming. This is our second year of MSU Libraries doing the Mississippi Land and Literature program series here at Cotesworth. We started last year to commemorate Mississippi's bicentennial. We had programs on William Raspberry, Women in Agriculture, and the history of the judicial system in Mississippi by State Supreme Court Justice Bill Waller Jr. This year we had a program by the University Archivist from Tuskegee University on George Washington Carver. So we hope and plan to do future programs. So again, thank you for coming, and we hope you will stay and enjoy wonderful food generously prepared by the volunteers at Cotesworth. And in the room across the hall, we have a display of Elizabeth Spencer's books as well as some newspaper articles on her writing. So thank you so much.